that are diversifying the most rapidly are America's suburbs, South King County, right? So you can see that by looking at Seattle. This is Seattle. The darker tracks here are higher percent people of color. 1980, probably what most people still thought of as being Seattle in 1980. In the year 2010, look at that change, and note that a lot of that change is happening in your suburban areas. Now, why is, by the way, that's happening all over the country. In Atlanta, in Denver, Aurora, which I used to think of as being just a white suburban community, is now extraordinarily diverse, et cetera, et cetera. It's happening all over the country. And why is that important? Because America's suburbs are places where the social services infrastructure is thin, often the civic infrastructure is thin, and often the community organizing infrastructure, which is how low-income people get their voice into the process, is thin. And so paying particular attention to bridging the gap between city and suburb, getting services into the suburb, is really critical. So, is any of that stuff interesting? That is nowhere near the most interesting thing to come from the census. Here is the most interesting thing to come from the census. And it has to do with the age population, or age structure of our population. For the country as a whole, and Seattle's basically parallel to the country as a whole, Washington to the country as a whole in this, the median age for non-Hispanic whites is 42. The median age for Asians is about 35. The median age for African Americans is about 32. The median age for Native Americans, Pacific Islanders, around 30. The median age for Latinos, it's a little bit younger in Washington, 27. 42, 27. That's 15 years. That's a generation gap. And it helps to explain two things. One is it helps to explain our demographic change, because when you're 27, you're in prime family formation age. When you're 42, you think you're in prime family formation age. You may be Godspeed. So it helps to explain a demographic change going forward, but also helps to explain a particular kind of generational disconnect that is actually problematic, and you're going to see it here in your own metro area. And that generational disconnect is reflected in the fact that the state that's got the largest generation gap is Arizona. With its fractious politics around immigration, ethnic studies, et cetera, and in the last 5 years, Arizona had the third largest cuts in K through 12 education per student, had the largest cuts in public university spending, and the largest increases in tuition for public universities. And we've been looking at that county by county, working with PolicyLink. This is spending per child, and this is done so the darker colors reflect more spending per child. This is the generation gap. You can notice that it's nearly a photo negative, right? And by the way, for those of you who are thinking maybe that's just an illusionary map, we actually did a time series cross-section fixed effects regression in which we control for the other variables which explain spending per child, which essentially just means I'm right. So this is generational disconnect is a big problem, and it's a bigger problem because actually the generational disconnect is growing in the Seattle area pretty rapidly. So this is the percentage gap between the percent seniors who are people of color, youth who are people of color. In 1980, not that big. It's widened dramatically. And the real question is, how do we get the current generation to invest in the next generation? And one of the reasons why this is important is because, including in Seattle, you've got tremendous differences in terms of the poverty rates facing ethnic communities relative to the white poverty rate. I'm going to jump over a few of these. And because we've got a big problem in the United States that so many of us know about that's being lifted up currently about the issues of income inequality. Income inequality and the way in which we've had a huge share of income going to the top 1%, but also income inequality and the widening gap between people who have some skills in education and those people who don't have a whole lot of that. And that challenge of inequality is actually faster in Seattle. This is a tough graph to interpret, so I'll just tell you what it says. In the 1980s, you could pride yourself because while the rest of the country was basically not making much distributional progress, in the 1980s, you were actually narrowing the gap. So you should feel really good about yourself 20 years ago. But what's happened in the 1990s is you got very close to the national average, and in the 2000s, you're now widening the gap faster than the rest of the country. So this is a particular issue in Seattle. It's an issue that you already know with regard to housing, and I just want to lift up this one last thing and then come to a stirring and emotional conclusion. That one of the ways in which some of the problems in Seattle are masked is that you import a lot of educated people. And what happens as a result, I mean, you should know that in Colorado, they call it the Colorado paradox, which Colorado looks pretty good because all the people who move into Colorado have higher education, have higher income than the people who are actually born in Colorado. And that is exactly the same kind of pattern that's going on in the Seattle metropolitan area. 30% of the people who are born in Washington, we can't do it by metro area, but they were born in Washington, in-state born, have a college education. 38% of immigrants have a college education. 44% of migrants from other states have a college education. So when you're thinking about who's competing for the good jobs and who's being left out, it's actually your local residents. And it's actually even more profound when you break it down by age. So if you look at the group 25 to 44, this is the percent who have an AA degree or higher by place of birth. So the group that's got the highest level of education, people who moved in from out of state. The group in the middle, immigrants from other countries. The group bringing up the bottom, you're homegrown. And unless you come up with a strategy to deal with that issue, your aggregate statistics about how your income doesn't look that bad, it's partly because you're leaving behind people who are actually growing up here, who were born here, et cetera. Does that make sense? And it's a very crucial set of issues, and it's a crucial set of issues to address, and now is the time to do it. Because while something is changing in the United States in terms of us thinking about our demography, there's another thing that's changing in the United States, and I really want this to be sort of maybe the key thing for you to take away. What's changing in the United States right now is the way in which we think about the relationship between income inequality and the economy as a whole. Now, we used to think in the economics profession, I'm not sure I ever thought, but we used to think in the economics profession that a little bit of inequality, maybe even a lot of inequality, might be kind of morally bad, might offend a few liberals, might get Rachel Maddow kind of mad, right? But it's good for economic growth, right? It's good for economic growth because you're distributing money to people who are high saving and high investing. It creates the incentives for people to do work. It moves stuff toward high productivity. But what's interesting is that that story is changing. That story is changing because, first, we've had a lot of inequality and really stagnant economic growth in the United States. So first, it's kind of obvious. Second, for the last 30 years, research has been emerging from the developing world showing that those countries that are more equitable, in fact, grow more rapidly over time. And last year, there was a very important study from the International Monetary Fund showing that the most significant predictor of sustained growth over time was actually income inequality. If you had a lot of income inequality, it reduced your ability to sustain growth over time. Partly as a result, I don't know whether you know this, but the single most popular book, #1 in Amazon right now, and probably #1 on the New York Times bestsellers list, is a book by Thomas Piketty. How many of you have heard of this book? How many of you read this book? Okay. Read this book. I mean, yeah, you can get it on Kindle though. This is a book, 776-page book translated from French. Not all that well. which might be one of the most important books that you will read, because what it talks about is the growing inequality and why it's actually probably slated to increase, but also why that's bad for the economy. And you might say to yourself, I don't know, I think that's like some French liberal dude, right? Who like borrowed his title from Karl Marx. So maybe you should read Joe Stiglitz, the guy who was the former head of the World Bank, right? Who wrote a book called The Price of Inequality. Or maybe you should go to the Davos Forum, the big global gathering of civic leaders and business leaders whose main message in the last global forum in Davos, Switzerland, was that the single biggest risk to the global economy is inequality. And we've been looking at this in America's metropolitan regions and beginning to say and find research that suggests that those regions that are more inequitable, those regions that have more residential segregation, those regions that have more social separation do not grow sustainably over time. Inclusion is not just good for your moral sensibilities, it can be good for economic growth, and I'll explain why in a second. But I want to just nail this home because I know you might be looking at me and you say, I don't know, I don't believe him. He's a professor from California. He probably came up with this idea in his hot tub. He spilled his computer into the hot tub and out came this crazy idea and these crazy research. Don't believe me. Believe that well-known left-leaning organization, the Federal Reserve. The Cleveland Federal Reserve did a study of 120 mid-sized regions, much the size of Cleveland. They found that the things they thought would predict economic growth, anchor universities, diversified industrial structure, they did. But that much to their surprise, what slowed economic growth was residential segregation, income inequality, when you have big separations between city and suburb in terms of the poverty experience. And we've been finding this as well in our recent research. And the reason why is when we're separated, we don't invest in one another. And when we don't invest in one another, we bring down the human capital that we need for the future. When we're separated, we wind up having fights around economic strategy rather than being able to cohere.